From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The president and chairman of the board of the University of Pennsylvania resigned over the weekend amid an uproar over last week's answers by three college presidents at a congressional hearing on antisemitism. The testimony and the outbreak of antisemitism on campus have triggered a new public awareness of the problems of ideological conformity on American campuses, especially at elite schools. Will it trigger changes that will make a difference? Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and I'm here with my colleagues Colin Levy and Kim Strassel. Welcome to you both graduates of American higher education, and none the worse for it. I'm not quite sure that applies to me, though I did get a BA as well. But let's listen to some of the testimony that triggered this political backlash.
Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric.
And is it anti-Semitic rhetoric?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
It does not depend on the context. The answer is yes, and this is why you should resign. These are unacceptable answers across the board.
That was Elise Stefanik, a Republican congresswoman from New York and herself a Harvard graduate, questioning Harvard President Claudine Gay at that hearing we talked about last week. Colin, why do you think that testimony was deemed by so many to be offensive?
Paul, I think people were just appalled because the testimony revealed this deep intellectual corruption on campus that we've known existed, but I don't think we ever saw it exposed in such kind of stark relief. And when you have the kind of moral equivocation that we saw from these three college presidents, I think it really made a lot of people call the whole educational endeavor into question, and, a system that is allowing us to be so easily lured into lawyerly answers. And I want to make one thing clear here. I think you know me, and I think from the beginning, I've always really been a free speech absolutist. And, the constitutional protections for freedom of speech and the press that the First Amendment provides are literally meaningless if the government gets to decide who they apply to. I've always thought that. But I think the lesson really that these protections were written to protect was unpopular, unlikable, and even horrible, loathsome speech. But remember, Paul, that the First Amendment was to protect against infringement of speech by the government. Okay, that is not the same as infringement of speech by a private university. So this is really an entirely different situation here. We're talking about the code of conduct at a private university, Harvard, Penn, also MIT, all private institutions. So we're talking about what the university does or says about speech. That's not the same as a government restriction that would be protected by the First Amendment. And it's why here in this congressional hearing, what people wanted from these university presidents was moral clarity. They wanted to hear them say, they may be technically right that they're not going to punish speech per se, but that doesn't mean that they can't say, we will do everything in our power to protect Jewish students on campus. We won't tolerate this in any form. And when you call for the genocide of Jews on campus, that is a kind of targeted harassment that won't be tolerated under any circumstances.
So President Gay of Harvard tried to clarify her remarks no less than two times, and neither attempt seemed to satisfy the critics. She said in her second time, I got caught up in what had become at that point an extended combative exchange about policies and procedures. Substantively, I failed to convey what is my truth, unquote. Kim, does that do it for you?
No, look, I mean, as Colin said, I think there's two things at play here. One is obviously the lack of moral clarity. You want more than anything the heads of these institutions, who thousands of children, young adults are looking up to for moral guidance, to condemn in the strongest possible terms any such behavior, instead of using words like, well, it's a context-dependent decision. That's one problem. But the second problem was the joke of watching these people stand there and say that they care about free speech, because they don't, okay? They don't celebrate it. They don't agree with it. They punish it in any other context if that context goes against progressive norms. It's a complete double standard. So, this was coming from a Harvard University president where every student is required to attend mandatory Title IX training, where they are taught that if you accidentally use the wrong pronouns when addressing one of your peers, that counts as abuse. Now, put that up against what one of these presidents said in that hearing, saying that anti-Semitism would only be viewed as anti-Semitism if it was directed and severe and pervasive. Then it might count as harassment. The reality is here, Paul, that we have a university system where everything is now viewed through the lens of the oppressed or the oppressor, where everything is done around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the reality is, because Jewish people are white, they don't fall into that classic oppressor, non-oppressor situation.
Well, they do. They're the oppressors.
Well, they're the oppressors. They're the oppressors. Right, exactly. And so they are fair game. And that was essentially what these people were saying at that hearing. They were couching it in all kinds of nice academic, higher academic language of context and the situation. But in reality, they were trying to defend a system that does not exist at their campuses. They do not celebrate free speech in any other context.
Just as a point of evidence on your assertion there, Kim, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression is an outfit that has been ranking free speech bona fides of college campuses. And this last ranking that they had, the most recent one for this year, Harvard finished 248 out of 248 schools on the fire ranking. And the University of Pennsylvania finished 247. I might add that your alma mater, Princeton, didn't do all that well. It was only a few. And mine was wretched as well. Dartmouth College was down there in the lower 200s, which is mortifying. But
can I add something to that? The 248 out of 248 ranking doesn't even entirely capture it. It was the first school that Fire has ever given what they call an abysmal rating, because it scored 0 on the 100-point scale. And in fact, that was with grade inflation, because its composite score was -10.
All right, let's listen to another exchange. This is with Congresswoman Stefanik with Elizabeth McGill, the president of University of Pennsylvania, until her resignation on Saturday. Let's listen.
Specifically calling for the genocide of Jews, does that constitute bullying or harassment?
If it is directed and severe or pervasive, it is harassment.
So the answer is yes.
It is a context-dependent decision, Congresswoman.
It's a context-dependent decision. That's your testimony today. Calling for the genocide of Jews is depending upon the context.
In that moment, I was focused on our university's longstanding policies aligned with the U.S. Constitution, which say that speech alone is not punishable. These policies need to be clarified and evaluated.
That second clip was Ms. McGill attempting to clarify her comments in that exchange on Capitol Hill in an attempt, I guess, to placate critics and perhaps save her job. It did not succeed. She resigned on Saturday, no doubt under pressure from the board. And then the board chairman, Scott Bach, also resigned. He said that they wanted him to stay on, but he decided it was best for him to resign as well. Colin, let's take up this idea of content specificity. I mean, of course, that's obviously true in the sense that if your speech starts to move into confronting an individual where you harass that individual so that he or she can't go to somewhere, they feel they're trapped in their dorm room, or there's a Star of David painted on the door of Jewish students, or something to stigmatize them on campus, that is a problem that deserves some kind of action by the schools. But is their legalism justified, do you think? And I guess, why did they fall into this trap of excessive legalism rather than just making a clear moral statement that might have not created this uproar.
Right. Well, I think we really need to address this issue of context that they're bringing up from a slightly different perspective. What they were trying to say was, well, the context has to depend on whether or not there was sort of physical intimidation or direct bullying. And at that point, the speech becomes abusive and is against the campus code of conduct. That's what they were trying to say. But I think what we need to look at sort of in a broader way is how the actual environment of a college campus is itself a context. When you think about it, these are relatively small communities where everyone lives together and they live together in something of a bubble, right? That's the whole college experience. They sleep in dorms together, they eat together, they go to classes together, they do their laundry together. So the university exercise itself is such a tightly woven one. So when you have Jewish students who are walking across campus and they're being confronted with anti-Semitic statements and anti-Israel slogans by someone who happens to live down the hall in their dorm, that's just an entirely different kind of experience of speech than if there's a protest in a public square and someone happens to walk by it and they might find the speech offensive, but they don't find it personally intimidating. So I think that's one thing that needs to be noted here. One other thing I just wanted to address is there's two things here. There's the intellectual underpinnings that we've talked about that only marginalized people can have the right to free speech. But there's also this habit that Kim was alluding to earlier, this pattern that's developed where students think it's completely okay to just shout down and verbally abuse and harass any person on campus whose ideas they disagree with. We obviously saw that at Stanford with Judge Kyle Duncan last year, and there's numerous examples of that sort of behavior that I think is coming out here.